4.2% of Australian adults, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, eat enough vegetables and fruit on a day-to-day basis.
Only 4.2%.
4.2%.
That's shocking.
Yeah. There's simple changes that you can make so that you can easily get that diversity in with a few little parts of planning and also being willing to try a few different things out.
Are there any other foods that you want to point out that you think are just a superfood or a great food to have?
One of the other ones I haven't called out yet is the omega-3 fatty acids. So they're particularly helpful when it comes to reducing inflammation.
While eating the right foods is important, avoiding some are crucial too.
Minimise intake, definitely.
Yeah.
So alcohol, it's very pro-inflammatory, even if it is in the form of red wine or something like that. Really focus on getting that diverse array of plants. Being physically active, count how many different plants you're currently having in your diet at the moment, and then use that as a baseline.
Chloe, thank you for joining me and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Emma.
Let's kick things off by you just sharing an introduction with our listeners and also your journey into the world of nutrition.
Yeah, of course. So my name's Chloe McLeod and I'm founder of Verde Nutrition Co, which is a nutrition consultancy business. I've been a dietitian since 2009. So you do the math. It's been a few years now. I feel really lucky that I get to do what I do, helping people to bridge the gaps in their nutrition. And this all sort of started because when I was a kid, I had a whole bunch of different food intolerances that I had to be really mindful of growing up. I got really bad eczema and found that food played a really big role in that. And that's sort of where my interest started off. I then started to play a lot of sport, hockey, netball, athletics, all the things that you sort of do, and had to be really mindful of fueling my body appropriately for that too. So pairing those two sorts of things together, incidentally, they're my two favourite areas of nutrition these days, and feel really fortunate to get to help people in that space as well as help my team and help lots of people in the nutrition space with bridging those gaps.
It excites me so much when we have an expert that has lived through something and then the passion comes from their own personal experience, because you really understand your customers or your clients and you understand what they're going through, the problems that they're facing, because you may have felt that at some stage. A topic that I'm really interested in discussing today is anti-inflammatory eating. It is spoken about a lot online, even in conversations that I have with people. So let's start by you just sharing what is inflammation, why is it important, like an important issue for our overall health, and just anything about inflammation from like a very general standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. So when we're looking at inflammation in the context of our overall health and well-being, we tend to be more looking at chronic inflammation. So there's two types of inflammation, chronic and acute. Acute is something that comes on quite quickly and it also tends to disappear quite quickly. So I like to think of the example of if you cut your finger. So you cut your finger, there'll be an inflammatory response and it tends to heal up pretty quickly. Whereas with chronic inflammation, it's something which creeps on much more slowly and might take a lot longer for somebody to notice. It tends to be more likely to be linked to a longer term or a more chronic health condition, hence that chronic inflammation. So some of the inflammatory health issues that are really common in today's society are everything from, you could classify obesity as an inflammatory condition, heart disease in particular is one, and then also your more sort of classic ones which we think about when we think of inflammatory conditions, so things like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or psoriasis or something like that. So there's lots of different types of conditions and inflammation can impact the body in lots of different ways as well. So I think a lot of the time when we think about inflammation in the body, it's of that chronic type, it's, you know, those inflamed joints, which it certainly can be, but it can show up in lots of different ways.
That's so interesting because when I think of inflammation, I think of like the red sore joints.
Absolutely.
And then you use like an inflammation like cream on your neck and then it just like calms things down.
Yeah.
But I never thought of it in the perspective of obesity. Can you touch on that a little bit? So why is it considered inflammation when we talk about obesity?
So the reason that we might look at obesity as an inflammatory condition, and there's lots of different ways you could view this, so I'm sure that there's probably some people tuning in who might argue that it's not. But when we're carrying extra fat cells in our body, that can end up causing extra pressure on various systems within our bodies. And as a result of that, that can end up causing different inflammatory processes to occur. The other part of that, and sometimes, not always, but quite frequently, elevated body fat levels will often also be linked with things like higher blood pressure, high cholesterol levels, elevated blood sugar levels, or it at least increases the risk of those things from occurring. And again, we know that those conditions are all more likely to be pro-inflammatory or end up causing more inflammation in the body as well.
And so can you explain to our listeners why inflammation is bad? So why is it something that we need to be educated on and something that we should, I guess, feel or see symptoms of that we should address it? Why is it bad?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm really glad that you asked, because it's not always bad. And I think it's a really important thing to be mindful of. So if you think about an instance where inflammation might be good, is you go to the gym, you train, you work really hard, you get a bit sore afterwards. And there's inflammatory processes which need to happen after you've exercised, which are going to help with getting the results that you've wanted, whether it's going to the gym, whether it's going for a run, or whatever the physical activity it is that you've been doing. The inflammation that I'm talking about that we're wanting to minimise or to avoid is that more chronic inflammation that I mentioned. So some signs in the body that it might be something for you to go and look at. And I want to be really clear that this doesn't mean there's inflammation, but go speak to your GP and get some tests done. But things like feeling really tired and fatigued all the time, not being able to focus, noticing changes to your digestion, so maybe feeling bloated, getting stomach pains, noticing that you're experiencing things like diarrhea and constipation. Even those sore joints that you mentioned before, they're also potentially signs of some of that more chronic inflammation. So if you're noticing things are a little bit off or a little bit out of sorts, it's really worth going and having a chat to your GP, getting some tests done. The most common blood tests to check for inflammation are to check your C-reactive protein, so CRP, or your ESR. So those are the two ones which are usually done, CRP more commonly. The difficulty with both of these, though, is they can show inflammation, but they don't tell the whole picture. So you need to get other things looked at as well, particularly if they're elevated. Also, elevation doesn't mean that there's an issue. For example, CRP will go up when you've got a cold. So in most instances. So it's not something which is like, oh, CRP's elevated, like my body's all inflamed. That's not the whole story. It's just a part of the picture. And I think that's why it's really important when looking at inflammation, we look at it holistically and take all of the different things into account and get that proper diagnosis from a specialist or from your healthcare team.
How common is it for someone to be experiencing inflammation? Well, in your experience with your clients? I feel like if I'm looking at my clients specifically, I probably see a larger portion of the population than what there is. But if we look at things like heart disease being an inflammatory condition, we know that that's one of the leading causes of death, or if not the leading cause of death in Australia at the moment. If we include things like your autoimmune conditions, so the RA, lupus and other conditions that fall in under that autoimmune umbrella, there's a much smaller part of the population, but their lives tend to be quite significantly impacted from a ability to go about daily lives due to the pain that they end up being in. And I think that's where I feel really lucky as a dietitian, and I know my team feel really lucky as dietitians to be able to support people through making changes to help with managing that inflammation and helping them to feel better. So that takes me to my next question.
Yeah.
How does food play a part in all of this? Like, what is the role of food when it comes to inflammation or reducing or potentially increasing inflammation in the body?
Yeah, for sure. So excellent question. So when we're looking at foods which can help with reducing inflammation, there's a number of different ways that we can look at it. We can look at it both from a specific nutrient perspective, and then we can also look at it a little bit more holistically. So if we start more holistically, looking at incorporating of a more whole foods diet, so 30 different plants, you'll probably hear me say that a lot throughout the chat today. The research really clearly shows that people who eat at least 30 different plants across the course of the week will have better overall health, in particularly overall gut health. And the reason I bring this up right now, rather than looking at specific nutrients first, is it's been shown, particularly in a study called the American Gut Project, that eating that variety or that diverse array of different plants. And I'm not just talking fruits and veggies, it's whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, herbs and spices as well. Getting that diversity in is the number one predictor of good gut health. Now, we know that a lot of the different health issues, particularly the inflammatory issues that we've been talking about so far today, they are often rooted in inflammation, or inflammation at least can contribute to their severity. I'm not going to sit here and say it can cause it or does cause it. Some cases, yes, but not always. And again, I think an important nuance to be mindful of. But if we can support and nurture good gut health, that's going to have a significant impact on inflammation levels in the body and how an individual feels on a day-to-day basis, regardless of any health condition that they may or may not have. A couple of things to call out here from a nutrient perspective that I think is really important outside of that diversity piece. Number one is fibre. So fibre is going to be a part of those plant foods that I mentioned, but most Australians are not eating enough fibre, particularly if we look at fruit and veg consumption. 4.2% of Australian adults, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, eat enough vegetables and fruit on a day-to-day basis.
Only 4.2%.
4.2%.
That's shocking.
Yeah, and that's actually reduced. So that's the most recent data. Last time it was looked at, which was like before this, was 2017, 2018, and then it was 5.4%. So a reduction in that sort of 5 or so year period in between the testing time. To me, that's terrifying, knowing what we know, that, there's so many people who are making great changes to their diets and looking after themselves really well. But I think that's in pockets of the population. So it's really encouraging. But if we look at broader Australia and broader the world, but we'll focus on Australia for today, those statistics around the fruits and vegetables are not great. I know we're going to be talking about ultra-processed foods and things to avoid, but there's some pretty scary stats around those as well. So things like chocolate consumption and potato chip consumption are both up. Again, looking at the most recent data, 10 and 16%. So again, when we're looking at that data, that's obviously not looking at anything other than consumption, and you can go and have a look on the ABS website if you're interested in looking at some of those numbers. But when we think about how much we're seeing in the media that people are making effort to be so much healthier, but then this data is not showing that, it feels to me like there's a bit of a disconnect.
So my question is, what is the recommended fruit and veg for an adult on a daily basis?
Yeah, great. And I've also gone off on a tangent, so I'm going to come back to the nutrients as well. So recommended intake, so 5 serves of vegetables per day and 2 serves of fruit.
What does a serve look like?
Yeah, so great question. So a serve of fruit would be, for example, an apple and a medium-sized banana, or a cup of berries and 2 small apricots.
That's one serve?
So that would be 2 serves.
Yeah.
So one serve would be like the apple or the berries, or for the vegetables, half a cup of cooked vegetables or a cup of raw vegetables, so a cup of salad equals 1 serve, and we need to have 5 of these across the day, is the recommended amount. In certain situations, I will recommend a little bit more than that. But I also think, again, coming back to those numbers that I mentioned, given where people are at, we're not meeting that baseline. So if we can hit that baseline or have more people hitting that baseline, that's one of the reasons I wanted to chat to you today, is because it makes sense. And if we look at some of the other nutrients, again, if we come back to the plants that I was talking about before, I know I mentioned fibre. One of the fibres to talk about here is prebiotic fibre. So prebiotic fibre, it is the one that feeds the healthy bacteria in your gut. So when you eat fibre, it digests, and certain types of fibre end up fermenting. What happens then is there's these byproducts that are developed, and they're called short-chain fatty acids. I'm calling them out today because they are some of the most anti-inflammatory compounds which develop in your body. In particular, there's one called butyrate, and this one has been shown to reduce the risk of bowel cancer, in that it's so strongly correlated with it that if there are some of those precancerous cells there, it seems to be able to help with removing those because of that presence of butyrate, which to me just blows my mind when go and read studies that are talking about that sort of thing happening. And that's produced though as a result of consumption of those fibres. So we need to be making sure we're including those things in our diets. foods where we might find prebiotic fibre, so things like your legumes, whole grains, a variety of different vegetables, so and fruits. So something like green banana is a really good one. Onion, garlic, broccoli, they're all really good sources of these prebiotic fibres, which are so important for our overall gut health. If we sort of go another layer up again, and I almost like to imagine a bit of a pyramid, if we've got our base of our diverse array of plant foods, our fibres, and then we get up to those smaller micronutrients. So things like our antioxidants. So vitamin C is probably the one most people have heard of before. It's an important one to call out though. And if you think about the word antioxidant and inflammation, so an antioxidant helps with reducing oxidation in the body. And oxidation is part of an inflammatory process, which is a normal bodily process. But if we can reduce some of that oxidation occurring, it can help with reducing some of the inflammation. So again, part of why those beautiful, colourful fruits, vegetables, whole grains, so on and so forth, the more diverse array of those we're getting in, the more different types of plant polyphenols and bioactive compounds we're incorporating, which are going to be really helpful for that immune or anti-inflammatory response.
So we need to eat 30 different plants a week.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
It's so funny. I feel like every time I talk about this to people, it sounds really overwhelming when you first say it. But then once you start to dig down into what people are eating, I find a lot of people are eating a lot more different plants than they initially thought. Granted, I've met someone once who was like, I'm eating Weet Bix and I'm eating potato. Never forgotten it. This was a number of years ago now. But for the majority of us, that we are eating a lot more diverse array of things than that. So, if you think about maybe what did you eat for breakfast this morning? And, let's say, for example, it was, it's winter, so maybe it's a porridge and you've put some mixed berries with it and some mixed seeds with it. So maybe there's 3 types of berries. Maybe there's some hemp seeds, some chia seeds, some flax seeds. Suddenly that's 7 plants once you add the oats into that as well. So without even trying, suddenly there's 7. And then if you maybe put some cinnamon in there as well, that counts too. Maybe at lunch you're having a salad for lunch that's got some 4-bean mix, so some legumes. So there's 4 different types of legumes there. Maybe it's a 5-leaf salad mix rather than buying just the baby spinach. So again, there's another 5, so suddenly that's 9. And that's without even adding anything else into that there. So I think when I say it can be easier than you think, sometimes it just takes a little bit of thought to start getting more of those diverse things into your diet. But once you start to do it, it starts to get really quite easy and it just becomes habitual.
So a sprinkle of cinnamon is considered as one of the plant foods. So there's no minimum to have for it to be considered as like, I ticked one off the 30.
I think that's one of the parts where the research hasn't quite gotten to the nuance yet. So the way that I think about it when I'm talking to my clients is let's get it in there. And, that 30 is the baseline. But if part of your 30 is that, let's say you've got 10 things that you eat consistently and the other 20 are from things like a sprinkle of cinnamon or a sprig of coriander, well, then that's where we need to work on. Yep. So there ends up being more of these tiny little amounts of things. But the 30 is the base and let's work up and make sure that there's a lot of variety across the week, not just variety in certain aspects. So it is a bit of a work in progress for people. And I think when you gamify it by going, let's get 30 plants in, it's a really good way to think about it. And it makes it so it's something which feels more achievable because you count how many you're having. Let's say it's 20, just to make it an easy number. And suddenly it's like, I've got to get 10 more in. How can I get 10 more in? Maybe I'll choose almonds for my nut snack rather than walnuts and for a few times this week. And maybe instead of always going for the stir fry that's got bok choy and carrot and capsicum in it, maybe choosing one that's got a bigger variety of different vegetables that are being included in it, as well as a bigger variety of herbs and spices. So it's just having that little bit of extra thought around it, which, yes, it takes time and thought initially, but over time, it's like any habit. The more you do it, the more the more easy it starts to become.
So chocolate is considered as one of the plant foods because of cacao, right?
I mean, sure, like we'll take that. I mean, if it's going to help, if it's not one we're going to want to have heaps of, right? But it's all about balance.
Everything in moderation.
Yeah, I'm not going to ever sit here and say not allowed to eat chocolate if that's one of the things that you want to include. So
tick.
Yeah,
plant tick. So I'm going to throw a spanner in the works.
Yeah,
because I wasn't planning on asking this question, but talking about the diversity that we need to have in our diet, particularly with the 30 different plant foods. How do you achieve that with the increase in cost of living? So a lot of people are bulk purchasing right now. Everyone knows that the cost of groceries has inflated ridiculously. People are struggling to even just get their basics right now. So what would you recommend to aim to get to close to the 30 while keeping in mind the cost of living and the increase in that?
Yeah. I'm really glad you asked that question because I think it's a really important one. So a few things I would consider if you're bulk cooking, awesome. It's a really simple way to, make sure that you're not having to spend heaps of money on groceries and have, single ingredients here and single ingredients there. What I would be thinking about when still making sure you're getting those 30 different plants in is utilising things which you can keep in the pantry, which are also anti-inflammatory. So as an example, things like your dried or your canned legumes. So I mentioned 4-bean mix before, so there's 4 different plants there. Then, there's heaps of other different types of beans and lentils and other legumes that you can include. Which you can purchase. They're all really low cost, cutting back on your meat consumption. I'm not sitting here telling people to become vegan or vegetarian or anything, but reducing your intake of meat and replacing some of that animal protein with plant protein, for example, from things like legumes and lentils, is a really simple way to reduce that overall grocery bill because, as an example, you can buy a can of chickpeas for about $1 versus, your thing of mince is about $10 depending on how much and which cut you're getting and everything. So it's a really simple way to help the meal go a little bit further whilst also increasing the anti-inflammatory impact of that meal. Also using things like dried herbs and spices as a way to get a bit more of that diversity and can work really well. The other part is planning. So thinking about what you're going to have across the week. If you know, for example, that you're going to be eating at home every night except for Friday night for that week, well then plan accordingly. Making sure that if you are cooking something up that you're not sure if you're going to be able to eat it because, plans can change, choose to cook things that you can chuck in the freezer and having things like your frozen vegetables, frozen fruits, they can work really well as well. So, it's not berry season at the moment, but if you're still wanting to include your berries because they are so anti-inflammatory, they're such a wonderful thing to include. I didn't get to them even yet in this conversation. But like a punnet of blueberries at the moment, I think it was about $8 or $9 when I was at the shops the other day.
I was going to buy some blueberries on my way home. Will not be doing that, buying a frozen pack instead.
Yeah, but I mean, you can buy, a kilo frozen pack for that. So rather than the little, 150 gram or so punnet that you're getting. So there's simple changes that you can make so that you can easily get that diversity in with a few little parts of planning and also being willing to try a few different things out than you might have usually tried.
I'm just really curious and I feel like we all need some inspo right now. What's a day on a plate look like for you?
Or for me, well, it depends a little bit on the day. An average day, I'm pretty partial to my porridge for breakfast in the morning at the moment, part of why I used it as an example before. And the example I used, that would be a pretty standard porridge for me to be having. So the mixed berries, the seeds and the oats, and I usually cook it in some soy milk because that's the milk that we tend to use at home at the moment. I love coffee, very open to coffee. Another little plant point for anyone who's wondering. So coffee bean, I'll tick that one off.
There's probably so many listeners that are like, well, I drink coffee every day, tick, chocolate every day, tick.
I think once we start to go red wine, tick, I'm probably not going to tick that one off because it is quite pro-inflammatory, but I know we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. lunch for me is usually leftovers. Again, from a convenience perspective, it just makes it easy. And whether that's the entire meal or whether that's taking, for example, some vegetables that I might have roasted the night before and then putting some of that 4-bean mix or something in there, it works really well. And then dinner will usually be some form of protein with some vegetables and some form of carbohydrate. So, for example, last night I had some grilled salmon with some sweet potato and just some steamed greens. The night before, I'm trying to think now, it was probably something like a tofu stir fry with some brown rice, mix of different vegetables. So I'm not someone who eats a lot of red meat. It's just my personal preference. So, yeah, I tend to get my protein and iron from other places. To come back, though, to what we're looking at from which foods and which nutrients. So I know I just called out berries before and I wanted to call them out for really important reasons. So blueberries in particular, they're really rich in anthocyanins. So the anthocyanins are a really helpful compound when it comes to reducing inflammation and also helping your brain work better. So this is where your frozen ones can come in really handy at the moment with that cost of living. So there was a couple of studies that were done a few years ago that were looking at cognitive function, so how your brain works, and blueberry intake. And these studies showed that a cup of blueberries, when you eat that for 2 to 6 hours after consumption, it improves how well your brain is able to function. And on top of that, if you're doing that daily, those impacts will continue to last in the coming months as well. So consistent intake of foods which are rich in these anthocyanins are particularly good for your brain health. And again, if we're looking at how to help our bodies work better, it's, I think, one of the best things you can do for your brain is make sure that you've got that high intake of the anthocyanins because of that anti-inflammatory impact that they have. Are
there any other foods that you want to point out that you think are just a superfood or a great food to have?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the other ones I haven't called out yet is the omega-3 fatty acids. So they're particularly helpful when it comes to reducing inflammation, again, helpful for cognitive function, skin health, all the different things. So they're particularly found in your fatty fish, so things like your salmon, tuna, mackerel. They're also in nuts and seeds as well, so walnuts, hemp seeds, chia seeds, flax seeds, except it's a different type of omega-3, so it's a different type of fatty acid that's in there, so it doesn't get absorbed quite as well. So the fish version is preferable because of its absorption rate, but if you're not eating fish or for whatever reason, maybe you're allergic or you don't like it, then you can get it in from those nuts and seeds as well. They're probably the main ones, I think. So your omega-3s, your anthocyanins, all of your antioxidants, and then your prebiotic fibers particularly. The other food I did want to call out, though, is extra virgin olive oil. I think it's one that gets a lot of mixed messaging, but it's also really well researched. And the reason I wanted to call it out is because there's a compound in it called oleocanthal. Now, oleocanthal is not found in anything else. It's only found in extra virgin olive oil. And it actually acts in the same way that ibuprofen works. So, your standard Nurofen or whichever other brand you're looking at. So 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil will give you about 10% of a standard serve of ibuprofen, which when you're thinking about it from a anti-inflammatory impact, that's a very strong natural anti-inflammatory. So some pretty amazing health impacts that can be seen from that. The analogy I like to think about with this one is when you think about how olive oil is made, it's pressed. So the flesh of the olive is pressed and the oil is actually the juice from the olive. And the way that the oleocanthal is formed is because of that pressure that the olive is under. So if you think about a diamond, how is a diamond made? It's when something goes under pressure. Your oleocanthal is about the same. So it's a little diamond in the rough there, which I think is a really important one to call out because of those important health impacts it has.
Wow, I actually didn't know that. That's so interesting. So while eating the right foods is important, avoiding some are crucial too.
Certainly is.
What are the top inflammatory foods that you think or recommend our listeners avoid and why?
So avoid maybe, minimize intake, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I know that you're really pro this as well. So I don't want to sit here and be the food police and say you're not allowed to have this or that.
Food police.
It's, the last hat that I ever want to be wearing. But some of the key things to be mindful of consuming. So alcohol, I touched on that already. It's very pro-inflammatory, even if it is in the form of red wine or something like that. So reducing your intake of that is particularly important when it comes to reducing inflammation. Sugar sweetened beverages, so soft drink or any other drinks that have sugar added into them, particularly inflammatory. Your commercially made pies, sweets, cakes, all that sort of stuff, they all tend to be either high in added sugar or high in saturated and trans fats, or both. So not so good from an inflammatory perspective. And then, just, your standard takeaway things. So things like your hot chips and heavily processed burgers and all that sort of stuff. So all things that, we all really love having.
All the yummy foods.
They're delicious, but they are pro-inflammatory. So let's minimize intake and really focus on getting that diverse array of plants, being physically active, and then if you're still having a little bit of it, it's not going to have such of an impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So outside of your diet, what are some other things that you can do to decrease the inflammation, or just anti-inflammatory methods that you can implement day to day?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So there's a few things here that I think are really important to call out from a lifestyle perspective. So number one would be smoking. So either quitting smoking or not smoking in the first place. I'm going to include vaping in this because that's, I think, a lot more popular at the moment. Getting enough sleep. So that 8 or 9 hours ideally. Obviously everybody varies a little bit in their exact requirements, but prioritising getting a good night's rest is particularly important. Being mindful to incorporate physical activity that you enjoy, and over-exercising or particularly high levels of exercise, as I mentioned earlier, can contribute to inflammation in a potentially good way, but being mindful of the impact that can have, particularly if you're not fueling your body well enough. You need to make sure you're fueling for the work you're doing when it comes to exercise. And then also being mindful of, living in a city, what's going on from an environmental perspective. So are you living somewhere where there's lots of greenery, there's lots of parks, there's lots of trees, or is it lots of highways, lots of pollution from cars and that sort of thing, because that can have an impact for people as well.
So interesting. So much information that you've provided today. So to wrap things up, if someone wanted to start on some anti-inflammatory strategies tomorrow from all of the information that you've provided, what are your top 3 recommendations to make an impact as of tomorrow?
For sure. So my suggestion would be, number 1, count how many different plants you're currently having in your diet at the moment, and then use that as a baseline. And then aim to add different ones in and categorize it down into the different groups that I mentioned. So your fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and herbs and spices. So if you're able to categorize all of those down, and you might go, I'm having heaps of different fruits, but I'm not having any nuts or seeds, and I'm also not having any legumes. Well, that can show a little bit of a gap, and how you might then be able to fill that gap by starting to incorporate, I'm going to go and buy a bag of mixed nuts to add in, or I'm going to add in some of that, those lentils that I heard Chloe talking about. So finding where some of those gaps might be for you, and then looking at how you might be able to incorporate those in. That would be step 1. Step 2. And step 3, if you are noticing that you're getting some of that red joint pain that we spoke about, or some digestive issues, or any of the other things that we mentioned, don't be afraid to go and get checked out. It's better to know than not know, because if you don't know, you can't manage it. So particularly if you are concerned that there is something going on and you're not quite sure what's happening, without that investigation, you're not going to be able to figure it out.
Chloe, thank you so much. All really great and practical tips, and I know our audience will highly benefit from this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I loved filming it, and I'll see you at the next one.